by Gularen Turan, who's the General Manager for Advocacy and Communications at the Global CCS Institute, and Mr. Faris Al-Kharousi, Principal Business Transformation Lead at PDO in Oman. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Great to have you. We're going to be discussing something very topical today. As we speak, of course, we know that the COP26 meeting is taking place in Glasgow in the UK, and the theme of our discussion today is COP26, big choices facing big oil, a big subject. And so we'll try and narrow it in enough for our viewers and get your insights on that. But certainly huge challenges ahead for the world on the transition, and particularly in the context of what we're seeing in the current energy market playing out. I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about that today as well, short term and long term. But what we like to do with our guests every week is also ask them to choose a story off our bulletin headlines there that we can see. And perhaps I'll go to you, Gularen, first and ask you whether any of those sort of took your attention and why.
Thank you, Dela. And if I may be a little naughty, I'll say actually two of them got my attention, and I'll very briefly say why the two, because I think they underline two key pillars for accelerating deployment of CCS around the world. And these news items are number 3 from the top, scaling CCS might mean thinking small, and also number 2 from the bottom, an Australian company is paid to bury its emissions. Regarding the first news item, of course, that is Carbon Clean and their modular solution that's been promoted. And I think it's just the cycle of technology, I believe. It's really important because it's showing innovation. Modular technologies in carbon capture are going to be important. They're helpful for retrofitting to existing power plants and industrial facilities, and we know that we're going to need to do them. Modular systems can reduce plant costs through economies of plant manufacturing. They reduce construction time, and shorter construction time also brings forward operational commencement, reduces costs, reduces risks, so it leads to significant savings. So I think this is really kind of an important step forward. I know Carbon Clean, who is one of the Institute's members, they have already sort of some dozens of projects around the world, facilities around the world, and to date they have captured and removed around 1 million tons of CO2, but I think they're taking the lead together with other companies such as Aker Carbon Capture, who are kind of leading on this modular CCS front. And this is just one area of innovation where I think we're going to sort of see costs come down, and that will help kind of deployment again around the world. The other sort of article, which I thought was kind of quite important, of course, happening at the same time, is in Australia. The Santos's Moomba project got the green light, it got FID. And one of the reasons for that is carbon capture and storage is now being included in Australia's emission reduction fund as an important sort of, as one of the carbon reduction technologies. And I think it's really important because for carbon capture and storage, we will need to see policy support to make the business case for it. And the fact that it's included in the emission reduction fund shows the importance of the recognition of CCS as a technology. I think we need to have we will need to deploy all the tools in our toolkit: energy efficiency, renewables, CCS, and others. And I think it's important, it's actually critical that CCS has that sort of like technology neutral, that level playing field, and its recognition, I think, in the emission reduction fund is therefore so important. And I'll stop at that.
No, thank you, Gularen. Great. And let's just stick to CCS and just kind of come back at you with that. I mean, it's clearly, as you said, one of many solutions being put forward. One point that's been made about CCS, particularly here in the Gulf region, where there's a lot of initiatives into it and a lot of investment has gone into it, is that so far it is still not commercially viable, and as you said, these small solutions are all contributing to that solution, obviously, ultimately. But the technology basically is simply not there yet to make it commercially viable. So how much is that a sticking point, and how fast enough do you think we can transition to a point where it becomes much more sustainable?
So I think that there's a perception that the technology is not available or it's not proven, and that's simply not true. The technology has been around since the 1970s, starting in North America. But as you said, there are actually 3 large-scale commercial facilities in the Gulf region, in UAE, in KSA, and of course in Qatar. The Gulf region is home to around sort of 10% of global carbon capture and storage capacity. So these 3 facilities capture and store around 4 million tons of CO2 per year. So that's quite significant. The global, carbon capture and storage capacity of the 27 large-scale commercial facilities we have today is around 40 million tons per annum. So I would sort of say that's fairly significant. Plus, we have more than 100 CCS facilities, and I'm not talking about carbon clean solution here, which is smaller and modular, but these are in the hundreds of thousands of ton per plant capacity. We've got more than 100 of them that are under development around the world. I think the problem or the issue is that we need to scale from, some 27 plants today to some 2,000 large-scale plants, say, by 2050. So scaling up is going to be the challenge, and the technology is there, but we need to have the business models to make it viable to commercialize, i.e., we need to have a sort of price on carbon emission reductions. We need to have policies in place to enable that this happens. Perhaps we need to have governments come in and help with build out the infrastructure, i.e. transport and storage. So I think there are sort of pieces of the jigsaw that need to come together, but it's not the technology that's the bottleneck. Having said that, I think innovations in technology, the more we build them, the costs will come down. We'll learn by doing, etc. So that's important too. But I like to point out that it's not technology that's the bottleneck. It's the need for a sort of sustainable business case around the world.
Okay, and let's talk about that. Faris, welcome again. From PDO's perspective, obviously from Oman's perspective, PDO is taking great initiatives in terms of, it has a collaboration with the IEA, for example, on the transition. It has a serious, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about its hydrogen ambitions, if you like, Faris. Oman's hydrogen ambitions, again, the region here in the Gulf is blessed with plenty of sunshine, and so, sort of clean hydrogen solution, if you like, using those renewables to produce hydrogen as a clean fuel. Faris, where are we at with that? It does seem to have had a big impetus, hydrogen, in the last year or two. Is that how big a part of the puzzle is that part of the solution that Gulran is talking about?
So it's all partially linked, and just to take a step back, because what Gulran was saying was like music to my ears, and I wish I could just expand on what she was saying. About a decade ago, when I was still a postgraduate student, I remember my course director being very sort of invested in CCS technology. And as students, we used to kind of mock him because we always thought that was like trying to solve the problem after the fact in carbon capture. But reality now is, and I'll come to hydrogen back in a moment, but reality is, if you look at the numbers being thrown around at COP26 and elsewhere, you're going to need to require about $4 trillion to $5 trillion in investment, especially in emerging and lesser developed economies, to get that kind of technology deployed. That money honestly isn't going to come by very easily in the short term. So CCS is very important. And coming back to the discussion about hydrogen, yes, countries like Oman have now announced multiple projects in the interior, in the south of the country, places where it strategically makes sense to deploy them. But the reality is, if you're looking at total global emissions or even regional emissions, technologies like the ones that Gulran have mentioned are going to become more essential to scale because there's also a time constraint within the next 3 decades, which I don't believe just investment alone will be able to close that delta on. So economies and smaller economies, they're not going to be able to deploy all of the sort of remitting agent.
Yeah, and what do you make of the argument? And I think one of our bulletin stories there addresses this, the sort of whole methane argument of, well, should we be focusing on that? I mean, carbon dioxide obviously is a huge emitter and is the cause of many problems in terms of climate. But methane is much more of a big bad boy, if you like. And yet, again, you know, how much can that be tracked? How can we focus on that? But do you think the world should shift its focus on developing solutions for tracking methane emissions and curbing that, or should we stick to the carbon capture?
Yeah. So I see the two articles, the second one and the last one, slightly connected. When you have chief executives from Shell and Total basically say, we weren't invited to COP, and even if we were invited to COP, governments need to get their house in order when it comes to carbon markets and carbon credits, and in the sense of they need somebody to police them. So coming down to the article about methane, the way you police somebody is by measuring what they're doing. And the observatory plans in, I believe it's Europe, is a fantastic idea, because honestly, until this very recently, there's a lot of extrapolated data, but accurate data to come by. Methane being, I think, I don't know, it's something in the order of 80 times, up to 80 times more damaging when it comes to global warming, is a real issue for the environment. And even though it's probably only gone up 20 to 30% in the last few decades, it's still a significant challenge for most economies, because most of it comes from agriculture, actually, not from the energy industry.
Yeah, well, Gudrun, I mean, on that point of, big oil has not been invited to COP26, and yet at the same time, it's being told to divest from its conventionals, invest more in its cleaner solutions. Are they stuck between a sort of a rock and a hard place? I mean, it's like, you're not welcome to come and join the discussions, but you are a big part of the solution. So, and are they right? It's fair to say in that article of saying, well, it's policy that has to act first. Let governments make things attractive for us as corporates to disincentivize.
I think it's both. I think it's, and I'm completely I'm agreeing with Faris as well. I mean, methane, and when you sort of said, Diala, whether it's methane or CO2, obviously it needs to be both. I mean, we can't leave, one of them on the table. And I think we need to address methane emissions, methane leakage, because yes, we're able to capture, for example, CO2 in a gas-fired power plant, but then we need to look at the life cycle emissions, and that becomes quite an important topic in Europe, for example, what does the life cycle emissions of gas production and transportation look like? So I think they need to be both. And in terms of is it governments versus kind of private sector? It needs to be both, right? It's a bit of a chicken and egg story. We need to have sort of carrots and sticks. So as Faris said, somebody needs to there needs to be, regulation has got a role to play in this as well. So it's not just, we talk about business models, which I think are really important, and hence I think it's really necessary that governments, private sector and the finance sector need to come together and sort of find ways of because I think finance sector is also quite important. How are we going to finance this transition? What kind of instruments are there going to be available, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but still a lot more work to do.
I'd like to talk about regulation and finance. I mean, on the finance point, Gudrun, I mean, would you say that that is proving to be I mean, the finance sector is also under pressure, as you said, the whole ESG thing, the sort of those directives for the financial sector to invest only in or much more in cleaner fuels. Is that proving to be a problem? Actually, Faris, I'll go to that, for energy companies like PDO into looking for finance, arguably. Is that proving to be a challenge in terms of the other stuff that you've got to carry on funding as well?
Yeah, so I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think most of the initiatives nationally will come through a lot of public-private initiatives where there's going to be collaboration between maybe a specialist type organization from Europe or Japan or wherever, coming in and lending some sort of financing, but with the government giving very sort of lucrative deals in terms of being tax-free and whatnot, and a lot of other goodies, and on the lease of land and whatnot. But I feel like financing is something that's going to be key to all of this. And one of the people that I follow very closely is the former governor of Bank of England, Mark Carney, and he's been a real advocate in this space about climate finance. And one of the things I think people need to realize is you are basically giving up the opportunity cost of a decade of lost GDP in the future if you don't get your house in order today when it comes to GHGs and climate change.
Okay, so, well, let me just, because you mentioned Mark Carney, and of course he's heading up this initiative on the whole offsets issue of obviously, which is part of the solution, big part of the solution, the global. Again, we haven't got a regulated global offsets market yet, and the examples that we're seeing where companies or countries are declaring they are offsetting are in question, and again, because it's not regulated. So let me just interrupt there and go to Güleren on that. In terms of regulation, that's one big area that's got to be surely resolved soon, to be taken seriously, right, with any of these initiatives. So how do we get there? How do we get a regulated offsets market which countries can sign up to and agree on?
I think there are two elements to an offsets market. There's the compliance markets, and of course there's the voluntary markets, kind of the two elements of it. And compliance markets generally kind of is being referred to, it's very topical, of course, this week and next during COP26, referred to generally as Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which oversees voluntary collaboration between parties and stakeholders and governments, etc., etc. And this is generally referred to as international carbon markets, and whether they can be linked. And when people talk about a global carbon price, that's normally what they refer to. And unfortunately, there has not been an agreement on the implementation and the guidelines for Article 6 yet. And, again, sort of it didn't come up, it wasn't finalized in Madrid in the previous COP25. And I think we're kind of hoping that it may be finalized sort of in this week and next. Fingers crossed for that. But that's a huge challenge that needs to be overcome in terms of kind of bringing about sort of carbon markets around the world. Voluntary carbon markets, again, is something that Mark Carney's initiative is working on. There needs to be transparency, there needs to be trust, there needs to be accountability, accounting for all of these. I think they need to kind of sort of work in parallel with compliance markets in some ways. But in my opinion, getting the sort of the big infrastructure, global infrastructure under Article 6 is going to be really, really important.
Yeah, and I mean, I was reading an article this morning that apparently Mark Carney was meant to be meeting with the President Biden at COP yesterday. He was meant to be talking on a similar panel, and because of security issues, they didn't actually get to meet and get to have their very important meeting at least. So even those security issues play challenging us. Baris, let me go to you on the subject of sort of cooperation, global agreement on sort of policy and trying to get all these international markets sort of together. Let's talk a bit about shipping. I know that's not specifically your expertise, but shipping was not included as a sector as part of the pledges made at the Paris COP meeting and part of that agreement. And yet today, is that something we should expect from the current COP meeting, that the shipping, of course, a huge emitter and polluter, will be brought under that umbrella within, keeping in mind the IMO 2020 directive that has been quite a success? What are your opinions on that?
It's a fantastic question, and even though it isn't my area of expertise, what you see now with the focus on Scope 3 sort of benchmarking, if you are an upstream operator and you are not doing you're only doing the direct reporting of what's happening on your oil fields, but you're not capturing what's happening once they get to a tanker or it's being shipped abroad, that's a little bit of a cop-out, mind the pun. Okay, so I think, and I think the focus on Scope 2 and Scope 3 benchmarking now, basically the indirect GHG and carbon outputs that upstream in the industry versus downstream is going to be something that will come out of this partially of COP26 in the next 2 weeks, gaining even more steam than it has recently in the last 2-3 years. Other industries get a really hard time. So the retail industry is a very good one because you can buy with a click of a button from Amazon. I can get my favorite, shirt in California and it arrives 5 days later here in Oman, and that entire cost of boxing, shipping, and everything that comes with it is a 10 times or even 100 times the fold of the original retailing damage to the environment. So I agree, shipping should be part of it, and it's a big part of it, but I'm not the one to speak to it about it.
Maybe we should be speaking to Amazon. They're certainly one of the biggest carbon polluters as we speak, but the world seems to be, relying on that to a great extent. Gulnaren, let me go to you and ask you again, back to sort of oil majors and their role. This last few months, we've had an energy supply crunch. It's a post-COVID effect, you could argue, pent-up demand, supply chain issues, etc. All of that feeding into, oil and gas prices. And the argument being made by some majors and even those who are sort of pro-transition is that, hang on a minute, this is all moving too fast. We've got to keep energy affordable for the majority of the world, and the only way to do that is to continue to invest in conventionals, cleaning up conventionals, of course. But it's a really delicate balance, and that there's far too another reason why all these majors should be at COP26, because should we be bringing them back into the equation? You've got all these new private solution suppliers which are perhaps better placed to provide solutions. Should we be putting big majors under pressure to convert their systems, or should we be splitting that market into new players? Where do you think that stands, given the sort of supply crunch we've just had?
Well, I think again, I don't want to speak out of turn, and I'm not the person to sort of say whether they should be broken apart or etc. But I clearly the concept of just transition is really, really important, and we're looking at big opportunities, but at the same time, we're looking at sort of big systematic changes in our sort of energy provision, and we also have to look at it from consumers' point of view, etc. So I think it's really important to have all the parties on the table. I don't think it's helpful to sort of say, to cancel some of them out or take some of them out of the equation. And oil and gas majors have been sort of very influential in providing clean, affordable energy for a long time. But clearly, we have a lot to do and not a lot of time. And they've got the expertise, they've got capital, they've got people. I just think that they need to be part of the equation in some shape or other. So.
And what about, let's talk a bit about geopolitics. I know, again, we're getting sort of a bit broad, but it is, we're talking about the big choices facing big oil. And of course, they are companies and businesses at the end of the day. And yet we have also, countries like the US and China, who are the biggest emitters and arguably either not doing enough on their home turf, and also not agreeing probably together because of all the other problems they have in terms of the current sort of geopolitics between them. So how important is that, Gulnaren, that we have, the powers that be, the biggest consumers in the world, sort of coming together more at the table for any of these technical solutions to really have any impact?
I think it's quite important, and there are certain initiatives. I mean, one of the reasons why, for example, Paris Agreement came about is because of the bureaucracy that's been carried out, and being able to kind of bring these leaders kind of together and come to a common understanding. And of course, President Xi's not attending COP is not great from that point of view. Having said that, from a technology point of view, for example, there is the Clean Energy Ministerial Initiative, a part of which includes sort of CCS activities as well, is important for kind of increasing collaboration. So I think at the sort of technocrat level, there is collaboration going on, but I think as you said, I think the tone is set at the top, and it's important that the world leaders, of the G20, of the G7, etc., in particular, kind of like, come to a sort of common understanding about and join sort of forces to accelerate our transition to a net zero future. I mean, India's Prime Minister Modi just announced a net zero target by 2070, which I think is fantastic. Again, another.
Let me just stop you there. I mean, having targets as far away as 2070. What is that? I mean, that's all well and good, and we've got 2050 targets as well, even closer to where we are. But that is just simply too far away, isn't it? Because so many things are going to happen in the interim, and those targets are going to change with the world. Why aren't we seeing only 2030 targets, 2025, 2030? Isn't that what the world needs?
So we need to. The 2050 came about obviously because of the groundbreaking IPCC 1.5 report that sort of said, we need to get to basically net zero by the middle of the century in order to kind of, stabilize at 1.5 degrees or less, and kind of with all the consequences that kind of are attached, and hence the 2050 as the kind of the date that's sort of in people's minds. But I think, you're absolutely right. We have to move from then 2050 to look at the shorter terms and the roadmap and how do we get to 2050. You're absolutely right. So we need to have interim milestones. And for example, what we see in the European Union is with the, now the 2030 target has been increased to 55%, but I think we have to start with setting, we have to start with setting targets. And at the moment, with kind of now India have set that, obviously China has it, US has it, etc. And KSA has it. But now 85% of global emissions are covered, come from countries with a net zero target at some point, sort of 2050 or later in the future. So I think that's really helpful. The next step will be, as you say, I think, and all stakeholders will start sort of saying, well, great, but then that's 2050. How do we get there? What's the target for 2030? And that's really, really important it's been a big driver for CCS, because when we look at those sort of net zero targets, I think the IPCC report I mentioned shows conclusively that we can't do it unless we deploy carbon capture, storage, and carbon removal from the atmosphere. So when we particularly look at that sort of 2030 horizon, it becomes critical that CCS is part of the equation.
Faris, in your opinion on that, I'm looking at the Gulf. Let's come back to where you're based and looking at this, obviously a huge producing region of oil and gas here. Again, are we seeing those countries in the GCC make enough serious short-term commitments? I mean, the poll that we have up there that we've got now answered 69%. That's very optimistic. Say that agreements that COP26 will put us on track for this very short-term goal, like we're talking about now. I personally don't believe we'll get there. There's been a lot of pessimism on the fact that it's too late already. That 1.5 is just not going to be achievable. Faris, in terms of what the GCC producers, if you like, and countries are doing here, are they doing enough in terms of serious action on the ground to meet goals that they've lined out?
So they're in a very strong position for various reasons. Number one, global demand for energy is going to grow, especially after we come out of this pandemic. Second of all, and I mentioned this prior, but in prior podcasts, there's a huge engineering base in most of these national oil companies in the GCC. That level of engineering expertise allows them to pivot to technologies very, very quickly. And I'm not talking about the 20, 30 years that you mentioned that you're concerned about. I'm talking about within 5 to 10 years in various aspects, not just renewables, but carbon capture and others. The only thing that's missing is what we discussed at the very beginning, which is the regulatory and compliance component to them. If there is not going to be any stick and it's all carrot as the dollar, the barrel of oil creeps up back to 100, you will see the bad behaviors come back. There needs to be something else on the other side of the equation. And I think that will happen. I think that will happen naturally, because even if they don't have shareholder activism, because they're mostly owned by the governments of each country, they will still have to deal with what's happening downstream, as I mentioned earlier. So yes, and not to sort of be defensive about the GCC in general, but I wrote an article a few months ago about how the Arab world's always been, we've been the producers of energy for the entire planet, not solely, but significantly. And yet most of historical carbon that's in the air, about 80% of it historically, we didn't burn it, I'm not saying that, as I say, the royal we as Arabs, but it's the rest of the developed world has gotten so much benefit of that, and they've more or less peaked in their emissions, and now they're reaping the benefits of efficiencies and alternatives and whatnot. So I think, are they doing enough? I think they'll be ready to do enough. That's how I'm going to answer that question.
Okay, well, let me ask you one last question. I'm going to put it to both of you to wrap up our session. Is, what would be your top COP26 at the end of next week? What would be your number one priority you would hope that they will reach a conclusion on that obviously hasn't been reached yet? What would be your number one choice?
Finalization of Article 6, implementation rulebook, and a technology neutral approach, and ideally kind of a bit more clarity on the clean development and joint implementation mechanisms, which incorporates CCS in them. So I think it's very important for the business community, as well as I think governments around the world, that we understand how Article 6 is going to be finalized.
Okay, and Faris, let you have that last word. One thing.
I think the financial systems, I think about 40% of them are already on board, but where does that 130 to 150 trillion over the next 3 decades, where does that money come from? Who's going to pony up for that? It'd be very interesting to see if we get some more granular detail about that. Yeah.
Faris Al-Kharousi and Gularen Turan, thank you so much for joining us on Energy Transition Dialogues. Thank you to our viewers, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks very much.
Thank you.